We will hear argument this morning in case 2512.
Grievances we could go into with this system. I think we could be here for hours.
National Collegiate Athletic Association.
I think we have some proof, even a few years into NIL now, that people care about the logo.
There are too many people in power who have no desire to give up that power.
The NCAA's ever-shifting decisions, not stable decisions.
Does the concept of amateurism in college athletics even matter anymore?
They've capped it again without any sort of collective bargaining.
We'll finish with our unilateral decision.
Back on May 1st, we went in depth on collective bargaining, on unilateral decisions. Fast forward to this week, I'll back up. When we talked about collective bargaining on the last episode, Sam, you'd said step one was players saying that they wanted to collectively bargain. And this week, we have that in Stanford coming out and expressing support for the College Football Players Association. First of all, I'd never heard of this group before, but it's apparently been around for 5 years. Am I the only one who has not heard of this group?
Probably not. I'm guessing you're probably not the only one who hasn't heard of it, because I think, there are a lot of these unionization efforts. I mean, we've heard of athletes.org. We've heard of We've heard of the Ramogi Huga group. We've heard a lot of these different organizations that have kind of been jockeying for position, but none of them have really been able to get off the ground. So, maybe at times we kind of hear about them and then kind of forget about them. But this is the Jason Stahl group, former professor at the University of Minnesota. And yeah, it is kind of a momentous occasion to actually have a group of athletes at a particular school, and not even just a particular school, because obviously we had Dartmouth before, but at a Power 4 school, at an ACC school, step up and say, we want to unionize, we want to be kind of part of the future, and have the future be collective bargaining. And clearly not the first time it's happened. I mean, I mentioned Dartmouth before, and we had Northwestern before that, going back more than a decade now. But in this new space of college sports, and I think Northwestern was in a very different college sports landscape than we are now, to have athletes step forward, and even with the House settlement and all the other antitrust lawsuits that these athletes are winning, to say we still want collective bargaining, I think is a pretty interesting outcome here.
Okay, so on the last episode, and for anybody that didn't listen to that episode but is listening now, it aired May 1st, and we went in depth on this topic. So go ahead and swing back through the library and pick that one up. One of the things you said was the process started when 30% of student athletes said that they wanted to unionize. When we went in depth on this, we were talking, student athlete wide, sport by sport. This one is all about football. Does this mean 30% of Stanford's football players said they wanted to unionize?
At least 30%, yeah. That's my interpretation. Though it is a little unclear, because it's not like they filed a union position. They haven't filed something with the NLRB. In fact, they very strategically said, we're actually going to wait until later to file something with the NLRB. The political landscape with the NLRB, with the Trump administration, is not one where we feel like it would be productive to file a petition right now, but clearly there is significant interest among Stanford's football team.
I read Ross Dellinger's article, and one of the things he was talking about, we got some quotes. The intent of this is to hopefully domino other institutions and get more people, especially in the ACC, jumping on board. It sounds like the Players Association is expecting a few more schools to announce that they have a willingness to unionize as well. We don't know what schools, what conference, but it struck me reading the conference piece, because you'd said in that last episode that it probably makes the most sense to do this at the conference level. So is that what's next? We need to see the rest of the ACC jump in, and then this group plans to negotiate and collectively bargain with the conference?
Potentially, though, that isn't the end of the story, because, one thing we also talked about on that last episode, and one thing that's been a big subject of various things that have been discussed regarding the story, Well, the ACC isn't just private schools like Stanford. It's also public schools like Cal, and maybe Cal's a bad example because they're in California, and California largely allows unionization. But it's also school. It also contains schools like Florida State and Clemson, and all these other public institutions that that in states that may or may not allow collective bargaining for public employees. And in fact, a lot of them, even if they do allow collective bargaining of public employees, they don't necessarily allow it to everyone. A lot of them are very limited to police, firefighters, teachers, or some combination of the three, usually just the first two, or usually just often just the first one. Yeah, it definitely would be a big step to have all the, because conferences are definitely what we're going to be looking at, and getting the full conference is definitely going to be a big step here to really kind of legitimize this collective bargaining effort and this unionization effort. But we still have to solve that public employee problem, and that's a solution that has not a lot of clear answers right now. That's for sure.
No, but it seems like the sentiment toward classifying student athletes as employees is starting to move in the other direction. Mike, are you seeing the same thing?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot more people in positions of authority come out and speak on the benefits and maybe not even benefits, but also just the reality of this is where it's going, so let's cut to the chase. I think we're seeing a lot more of that. I think there was a lot made of Kyle Whittingham's comments the other day, but we're seeing more and more athletic directors come out and speak on this. And I think it's a matter of time before it continues to move into positions like conference offices and, and perhaps more mid-sized governing bodies rather than just individual institutions. I do think that's what it's going to take, mostly to Sam's point there. But we're still a long ways away from the reality of, the challenges that the Dartmouth group faced, the challenges that the Northwestern group faced. Those challenges still exist. It's awesome to see that an ACC institution has gotten to this point in the current climate, given that we've all talked about this being the end game, right? The employment piece and potentially collectively bargaining. And so for a school of Stanford stature to be moving in this direction, I think that it gives credence to that rising tide. But a lot of these challenges still exist. And until there is more of a groundswell and more of a majority, I suppose, or closer to a majority, we're going to have a hard time moving this forward. And so that's what I would want to come back to with Sam or Joe, with yourself, of just what's got to happen next. It's great to have one school say this. I think that it was very intentional in Ross's article that the commentary was about how there's more coming, because we've seen this story before. We have gotten to this point before. We have not gotten to the point where there has been collective action among multiple groups in this category to be able to maybe have that further conversation. Certainly the landscape is different now, and maybe we're able to get closer to that opportunity. But until we see multiple schools that are similar to each other, because frankly, Stanford and Dartmouth organizing at the same time also doesn't really solve the issue. So Sam, or Joe, where do we go from here? And honestly, how quickly does it have to happen? Because of the turnover on the rosters, players are gone, threshold changes, political landscape you talked about, that doesn't change as fast as college rosters right now. What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, I think to your point, getting a majority of these athletes to want to unionize across a conference or across the sport in general, I don't even think that's necessarily the biggest barrier, because I go back to the public employee issue. I go back to the state law issue. And, I encourage you all on Twitter or X or whatever we want to call it. There's a account. There's a lawyer named Scott Schneider, and he's been very critical of a lot of people who are just kind of advocating for collective bargaining. And he's a really good follow because he really does a lot to explain the legal issues that are really inherent in kind of saying, oh, well, we could just collectively bargain and that's the end of it. It's no, there's actually a lot of complexity here, because you do have this hybrid public-private kind of enterprise. And it's not even necessarily as simple as, okay, well, we just have, the ACC kind of, being declared the employer and them kind of taking on all this responsibility. There's a lot of complexity to it. And to that end, like, I don't even think it's a majority of the athletes to unionize. That actually might be harder than what I'm about to say, because, given what you've been talking about, given kind of the way that administrators are starting to see this. But I think we need to have a majority of the schools say it as well, because I don't think this is going to happen from just Stanford saying we want to unionize and filing a petition with the NLRB. There's still going to be those jurisdictional issues that they identified in Northwestern, because so much of the ACC is public institutions, just like Northwestern was facing with the Big Ten being all public institutions but them. And the same kind of jurisdictional issues are going to arise, the same kind of questions are going to arise, and the same thing that we saw with Dartmouth, where Dartmouth says, we're just going to refuse to bargain with you. We don't recognize you as a union, even if the NLRB does. We're going to appeal this to the full NLRB board, and then we're going to appeal to the Court of Appeals, and then we're going to appeal to the Supreme Court, and take all of this time and run out the clock to exactly what you're saying, Mike, until there's there's change in the rosters where it's, unionization is no longer desired. It's not going to happen. But through voluntary recognition, which may also include, and good luck with this one, it may also include the states voluntarily recognize it, and states saying, we're willing to change our collective bargaining, our unionization for public employees laws to facilitate this change, it's probably not going to happen. Or at least it's going to be very difficult to make it happen.
Well, going back to Mike's question too, like you asked how fast this needs to happen. I can't fathom that once schools start fall camp, like these conversations are probably over, in my opinion. I can't fathom that you're going to get the entire team together with somebody that wants to, like, it's all in football from day one of fall camp. I can't fathom that. So to your point, like, whatever happens between now and the start of fall camp, like, that's probably it for now. And then there's going to be turnover, and who knows what years the people that are interested in getting this off the ground are. But I guess my question, Sam, is it was intentional that they want to negotiate at the conference level. Like, this wasn't unionizing at Stanford with Stanford.
And that's
the
probably the end game
behind
here.
that to me.
That's the end game here. That goes to the public employee point, and really just goes to the idea of collective bargaining in general, because you see it in the sports leagues. Like, you don't have, players for the New York Jets negotiating with the New York Jets. You have players with the New York Jets and the Denver Broncos and the New England Patriots, and why am I saying all AFC schools? I don't know. But all the NFL players are negotiating with all the NFL teams, because you need governance across the entire thing. It's what we call in the law as a multi-employer bargaining unit, where you need stability across the entire industry. It's a unique kind of industry. It's necessary. It's something that both parties want. So you have negotiation, you have collective bargaining discussions that would apply to the entire industry or the entire landscape, instead of just one individual shop, one individual workplace. And the same would have to be true here. You can't have a collective bargaining agreement that only applies to Stanford, because, then Cal and Florida State and SMU and Clemson and North Carolina and Duke, they're subject to different rules. And again, that's exactly why Northwestern, that petition got kicked.
So then why the ACC and not the NCAA?
I think for a couple of reasons. I think one, there might be a feeling that the ACC might be more willing to collectively bargain. The NCAA is the NCAA. They tend to be pretty regressive in things like this, and they're also looking out for the entire NCAA. Like, I'm being a little bit glib with this, but they're also, saying, well, this is going to set a precedent not just for the Power Four, but also for Division II, Division III, and we don't want to kind of be in that business. And I think the second reason is very simply, the conferences tend to have more control, so maybe easier to establish an employment relationship. And the conferences are also smaller, so it's just easier, like to your guys' point about the time that's necessary. It's a lot easier to, as big as these conferences have gotten, it's still a lot easier to try to organize all the athletes across an 18-team conference, or however big the ACC is at this point, rather than the entire NCAA. And if you need 30%, then 30% of those teams is a lot smaller than 30% of the entire NCAA.
So what's next? I mean, it feels monumental, but it also, when Mike was talking, we are so far away from anything happening. Like, what's next?
Well, I have a thought, but it's also a question. And getting to this point about the public employer piece, and I've been on the record for a while now of saying that I think that the outcome we get to is that the athletes themselves, at least in the sports that it's deemed, hey, the school is treating them like employees, and they are going to continue treating them like employees. Once we get that sort of decision, and we then have a juncture of, okay, then who's going to employ them? I think that the answer becomes a private entity that employs these athletes. Obviously much easier said than done, and that's kind of what I want to get at, is like, how does this move to more of a sports club model where it is like the pros, and the use of the school, of the university marks and logos, their facilities, their stadium, all of that is licensed to this club, but the club is the one paying the athletes. I know that's not going to happen until it is absolutely forced upon the industry and the individual schools. But what would potentially lead that to happen? Is it the decision on employment? Is it pressure for collective bargaining? Is it pressure to keep up? Like, if there's enough schools that allow for collective bargaining in the current structure to say this is where it's going, either get on or get off, then the schools that are outside of that realm have to make this choice. What do you foresee being something that would lead to that? And maybe you don't agree with me that that's the outcome here, but play with me that it is. What would lead to that, do you think?
I think the problem with that approach is that the schools would have to do it themselves. The schools would have to change the structure to facilitate that, to give up a lot of their control, which they would not be happy with, where to make it so that the athletes are being employed by the conferences or by some other private entity, whether it's a new NCAA or whatever. And that's, schools don't like to give up control. Nobody likes to give up control. Control is good to have.
Honestly, I'm talking a localized group that is
even
basically
then,
what collectives could have become if collectives would have been the power brokers.
Yeah, even then, the issue becomes you have to convince a court, because what's probably going to happen is someone with standing, whether it be the states, looking to enforce their union laws, or anyone else who again has standing to kind of challenge this based on a violation of the state law at issue, and saying no, this isn't a new private employer who's controlling these athletes. These athletes are actually employed by are still employed by the school, and these are public institutions. You got to get the states on board. You got to get the states okay with it, and it becomes a lot easier if the states are willing to change their laws to make that happen. To be able to either change the laws to kind of divest or to very clearly divest kind of that control to a private entity, or more cleanly just change their laws to allow for public employee bargaining. But that creates a lot of.
You think college athletes are going to be the reason that changes in a bunch of states? I mean, I've been wrong on that before, but holy cow!
Well, there are a couple of approaches there, neither of which are very helpful politically. You could say, well, we're just going to create an exception for college athletes, like we do with police and firefighters and teachers in some areas, which would probably get all the other government employee unions very upset. Or you do it across the entire board, which all the conservative interests in the states would get very upset. So really no good solution there. But it's something that, like, I don't necessarily see it happening unless you do that, because I think you could still point to the idea, like, even if you have to completely divest control over this private entity, and even then, I think there's a lot of ways where plaintiffs or like states attorney generals enforcing their laws can point to it and say that it's just a sham. It's not actually something that actually does divest that control, because it's still so closely related to the school, and especially if they're still students. Like, if we want to do it where we have Ohio State University Athletic Club, and it's not student, it's just the professional athletes playing under these Chase Bank branded jerseys. Maybe that's a way to do it, but if they're still students, if they still have that control, like, it gets tricky.
This is so complicated.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm an institution. So let's say that a few more schools do get announced in the next couple of weeks. Are these schools? Are they now? I mean, I'm asking on behalf of whatever future institutions are having this conversation with their athletes. Are they now needing to treat them differently, knowing that they are wanting to unionize? I mean, Stanford's kind of said we want to do this in the future. We can get more on board. Is there anything that needs to change at the institutional level now that this is public?
No, not at all, because they haven't filed a union petition. They haven't filed a request to collectively bargain. They haven't sought elections yet, and they're seemingly not going to do so until there's a change in presidential administration, which may or may not happen in a couple of years. We'll see. But for now, there's really nothing they need to do, and that kind of brings up an interesting point, because I don't know if maybe I just missed it, but one thing I noticed is the response from Stanford. Has Stanford actually said anything about this? Have they responded in any way, shape, or form?
Not that I've seen.
I haven't seen anything, and I think that silence speaks kind of volumes. Where maybe they're just ignoring it, maybe they're just saying this is going to go away. But I'm also real curious because given how many administrators have come out and said, actually collective bargaining is probably the way to go. I wonder what they're talking about in that athletic office. I wonder. Andrew Luck is the football GM. I wonder, he's a former player. I wonder if he's saying, we're just not going to say anything because we don't want to piss off the NCAA, but we actually do kind of support this. And maybe we're going to treat our athletes a little differently to kind of nurture this and make sure it survives to the point where they can actually file a petition.
Okay. You said...
Just a curiosity.
I mean, you said they don't need to treat anybody differently right now because... they haven't actually, filed anything. What if the next school does? Does that change anything?
Then it gets really, really interesting because we'll have to see what the NLRB says. We'll have to see what the regional board says first, and then the full board. And, of course, the school as well, because ultimately, this gets really, really complicated because I don't know.
It's already really complicated.
It's already really complicated, but I can't think of a situation off the top of my head where the employees wanted to unionize, and it was unclear whether they're employees or not, which is still a threshold issue here, still a really important issue here. Are these athletes actually considered to be employees under the NLRB test? And yes, this regional board said that they are in Dartmouth, but will another regional board feel the same way? Will the full NLRB board read it the same way? I'm not sure. But there's another variable here, because like in the example I just talked about, maybe with Stanford or maybe with another school, what happens if there's voluntary recognition? Because that's a way to bypass the need for an election. That's a way to bypass what I think at least, a good amount of the NLRB review, because you're voluntarily recognizing this union. I wonder what would happen in that circumstance. I don't have a good answer for that. Oh, I know the NCAA would be very upset, and they'd probably file their own thing with the NLRB, which, boy, that gets real complicated politically and legally and practically.
Okay.
I don't know. I'm going off my academic soapbox right now. I'm just thinking about all the legal questions, and so that's just one of the benefits to being in an ivory tower, I suppose.
I think you're just trying to confuse me even more than I already am. Okay. So Stanford comes out, says the football team says, at some point in the future, we intend to unionize so that we can collectively bargain with, the ACC. The next step we need all these other schools to do it. I mean, if there was a majority of schools in a conference, 10 of the schools have football teams that say they want to do this. Do they need 100% to move on to the next phase of this, or can a majority of the schools trigger something league-wide?
I do not know the answer to that question, because it's something that, as far as I know, has really only been explored in the Northwestern case, and that was one out of, I think it was 12 at the time, and the other 11 were public schools. in this case, what is the threshold for the NLRB to step in and say, yes, there's been enough of this particular landscape to be able to declare there's a union and enforce collective bargaining. I don't know what the answer to that is, and again, it gets even more complicated because of so many of these employers are public employers. But it's yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I feel like I should have an answer, being the legal person on this podcast, but it is, to my knowledge, it is a completely unresolved issue.
I want to go back to the voluntary recognition piece just for a second. So if we're talking about schools, I mean, this is beyond an athletic department at this point that we've been making this decision. You're talking about universities, you're talking about State Board of Education, you're talking about, in Stanford's case, obviously not a state board necessarily, but they've got their own regents and everything else. And so I'm curious, like, if you've got administrators in a room debating this, like, what are the sides of that? What are the sides to consider if you've got an athletic department on one side, a general counsel on another, regents, maybe there's groups that are on campus that are already unionized that may be speaking into this in some fashion. What are the debates that are being had around that table? If you could take us behind the scenes on what you think that would look like.
I think on one side, the pro unionization side, the pro collective bargaining side, you probably have a lot of comments like we saw with Kyle Whittingham, like we've seen with Danny White and so many other administrators, Jeremiah Dickey, saying collective bargaining is the future. Let's get out in front of this. Let's not fight this. Let's facilitate this so we can move on to the end game, so we can try to get some stability, so we can, start to negotiate a salary cap that's actually enforceable, and eligibility rules that are actually enforceable, and all these different things. On the other side, I imagine there's a lot of people in the room saying, if we allow this, if we facilitate this, if we don't fight this, we might get kicked out of the NCAA. Because that's kind of my read of the situation. I mean, obviously the NCAA is so adamantly opposed to employment, and sure, it's the will of the members. But I remember, California, they back in 2019 when they passed the Fair Pay to Pay Act, the NCAA's response was, if this bill passes and goes into effect, we're going to kick all the California schools out of the NCAA. Obviously, that never came to pass. I think it was very questionable whether that was just an empty threat, because are they really going to kick out UCLA and USC and Stanford and Cal from the NCAA? I don't know. But this also seems several steps beyond that, where, the NCAA was at least willing after that to be like, okay, well, let's figure out a way to do NIL on our own terms. And then, of course, Alston threw a major wrench into that. But, this feels a little different because, there's really no way of controlling this necessarily. There's no way of, once they're employees, they're employees. And once
a
they're...
line in the sand.
It really is. Like, NIL, at least you can find a way to, but for antitrust law, I suppose, there's a way you can kind of control it and have some guardrails. Clearly that is not borne out to be the case, but back in 2019, they felt this way. There's no way to have guardrails around employment. Like, that's not something you can necessarily manage or control. At least until unless there's federal legislation that allows for non-employee bargaining.
So we heard, that the SEC was building, backup plans should, legislation, not go the way they want it to. And now we've heard something similar out of the Big Ten. I mean, for either of you guys, should we be assuming every conference is having these conversations right now?
If they don't, they're behind the ball. That's my view.
Yeah, I do find it interesting though. Like, what do you think that conversation would be at a certain level, right? Like at the American or the Mountain West, is it what you want to align yourself to? Because you're not the big fish, and certainly you know that. And so, is it what you want to be a part of? Is that the conversation you're having? I think it's an interesting deal. I mean, we've obviously talked a number of times on this podcast about, like, at some point having to just be true to yourself. What it is you want to be good at, what do you want to make your sort of, like, North Star, your guiding light. And so I think that's got to be some of those conversations. It's tough because you're doing it in a vacuum when you don't get to control the things on the outside that you're kind of trying to make decisions about. And, frankly, I mean, Joe, you've been in the same rooms. A lot of us have been down that road when it's around conference realignment and things like that, where you're trying to come up with what it is that you would want to do if you got to make the choice. But a lot of the things happen to you, and a lot of choices happen before there's a trickle down to you that you've got to kind of game plan for, and you've got to figure out the different forks in the road, and if you were going to take this one or that one, and if this opportunity presents itself, these are the things that we would want to consider. But you're also having to say, well, if it got to that fork in the road, is it because of this, this, and this, or is it because of this, this, and this? And what if it's a combination of those two things? And I think, if you're one of those conferences, and I don't, maybe the ACC and the Big 12 feel similarly. I don't know. We've all talked, anecdotally about the Power 2 at this point. It's interesting to know where those guys would sit, but certainly the ones next in the pecking order after the ACC and the Big 12 have to be thinking, where do we want, what are we going to hitch our wagon to? Like, what is the thing that we want to be a part of? And I go back to, kind of we've talked about it on the last few episodes about what I put out there of a few years ago of having to just like try to do it for yourself and figure out what are we going to be happy with no matter how the other thing breaks? How are we going to position ourselves in a way that we're proud of and comfortable with and we believe is serving those who we are meant to serve? Whether that be the student athletes, the universities, if you're talking at a conference level, is it the universities you serve? Is it the student athletes that are part of your conference now and will be in the future? Is it the communities that you're a part of? Is it like a broader belief about where sport fits in society and what your role in that is, or higher education and what your role is in that? I think those are the questions everybody's got to be asking themselves, unless they just want to be part of whatever the preeminent capitalistic beast of college athletics becomes. Then they just get to go along for the ride.
I mean, are we in a situation right now, Sam, where, I mean, obviously you can't state with 100% certainty, but I mean, we can read the tea leaves. The collective bargaining process seems to be underway behind the scenes, but we're just waiting to see if legislative action is going to bail this out.
Yeah, kind of. I think, because like, you mentioned the Big Ten, the SEC kind of planning for collective bargaining as a potential option, but it's always option B. Option A is getting favorable federal legislation, and I say favorable because the SEC and the Big Ten got their federal legislation. It's just not to their liking, so they're fighting it, and I guess we'll see what happens with that. But even then, the chances of that passing through, maybe it can pass the Senate, but the chance of it passing through the House seem rather bleak. So, yeah, I mean, but again, like, federal legislation is always going to be option A, and of course it's going to be, because why would you negotiate? Why would you have subject yourself to collective bargaining and labor law and the stick of labor law when you could just have the carrot of an antitrust exemption handed to you by Congress? I mean, I'm sure any unionized workplace, or at least most unionized workplaces, would absolutely love to not have to collectively bargain and just be given an antitrust exemption if they have it. Granted, not every workplace needs an antitrust exemption because it's just complicated, but I'm sure the NFL and the NBA and I'm not going to say Major League Baseball because they do have an antitrust exemption, but I'm sure all the rest of them would love to have an antitrust exemption. They have certainly pushed for it many times over the years. Looking back at 2010's American Needle v. NFL, which went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, you are not a single entity, which would have exempted them from antitrust litigation. They've tried for years to try to get that, and they just can't. And the NCAA has this unique opportunity where they're able to go to Congress and say, we need an antitrust exemption. It seems that at least some of Congress is willing to give it to them. And why would you collectively bargain if you have that in your back pocket? Why would you go through all that? And it's not even why would you go through collective bargaining, but why do you go through the whole rigmarole and the legal issues that are just inherent to collective bargaining, including employment status and just getting the darn thing off the ground in the first place, and bypassing all those barriers with public employment and all that. It's always going to be option based, and for good reason.
That's a really good point. And I think honestly, just even listening to what you said there, I feel like I can feel myself having more sympathy for the NCAA leaders and those in that camp than I have recently. And I get it. I get that if you feel like you're on the doorstep of this thing that anyone in your shoes has tried to get forever and you feel like you're close to it, how dare someone in your sphere like do anything to get in the way of that happening? I do get that. Whether I agree with it or not, different story. I can understand that position, and that does make this tough. I mean, there's a little bit. I think if I'm being a little snarky, like there's definitely some sunk cost fallacy in that mindset. I think, but there's a lot of cost that's been sunk, and so I get that too. And there are people who the folks that are in the room right now are, on the backs of, who have been trying to do this for decades, and now it's a legacy that you're trying to carry on and you're trying to do, and it's your job to carry that torch and try to get it done on behalf of the organization. And so it's tough, and I do have sympathy there, and probably more so just from listening to you talk the last couple minutes than I had before. But man, it just feels like there's an element of doing the right thing also. And if you're going to keep treating the athletes this way, is the right thing really to say we lord over you because we have the opportunity to take it away from you? Like,
Well, I imagine you probably know better than I do, being in athletic administration, but I'm sure they don't see it that way. I'm sure most people in college sports do not see it as lording over the athletes. They see it as, we are here to provide this educational system, and just because it's been corrupted, as they would probably say, over the past 5+ years, doesn't mean that there's still not this educational value that we are providing to athletes as the inherent core of it.
And that's true, but there's, whether they want to admit it or not, there is an element of being holier than thou if you are going to sit there as an employee with all of the benefits of employment and say that about someone who you don't want to be allowed to be an employee, when you want them to be treated the same way, essentially. And you want to make sure that they're showing up when you tell them to show up, and they're doing everything you ask them to do. And you're going to tell them that there's an artificial barrier on what they can earn and how they can operate and how they can move from one thing to the next. And we talk about the argument with coaches all the time, right? I mean, it's like anytime a coach comes out and says what they want to see, and it's like the easy pinata of them putting it out there on Twitter or wherever else. And it's like anybody's like, oh, well, would you accept that? Would you accept a cap on your salary? Would you accept the ability not to move in the middle of a season, Lane Kiffin? Like, so, I mean, there is a little bit of that, like, here, you stay in your spot. So I don't know. I guess I have a harder, now I'm back to not being sympathetic. So thank you.
Full circle.
You're very welcome.
Okay. I got one more before we go unilateral decision. Okay, let's fast forward. Let's pretend that legislative action does not take place. And let's assume that because we've heard, that a couple conferences are working on collective bargaining models. Let's assume that all of them are doing something in some capacity, because if two of them are, you got to assume everybody's at least looking into it. Could a conference come out and voluntarily recognize a union that doesn't exist? Like, let's say there's not somebody in, Mike said Mountain West. Let's say there's not a school in the Mountain West that's come out and said, the same thing that Stanford did. Could the Mountain West still say, hey, we've been working on this, and we believe we've got a framework, and so we're going to voluntarily recognize any union that comes to fruition within the Mountain West Conference?
That's a really, really good question. And one thing that, boy, it's funny, we only have these conversations in sports, huh? Because it's just the idea of an employer coming out and saying, we're going to voluntarily recognize a union before you even form one, before you even talk about forming one. You probably have a lot of managers across the industry that are just cringing in their seats right now. but it, unionization and collective bargaining, hit differently in sports because you need to have some kind of competitive balance structure a lot of the times, and that requires antitrust relief, and that requires, the stability of a collective bargaining agreement. But to answer your question, I know I'm filibustering a little bit. The answer is no, at least not in a way that would have any kind of legal effect. For the Mountain West, Gloria Navarez can come out and say, hey, we extend an invitation to athletes to in the Mountain West to unionize, and we would love for them to do it, and we'd be happy to voluntarily recognize that union. She could do that. I'm sure the NCAA would be unhappy, but that's a different story. That's not the question you're asking. But it does not behoove the athletes to unionize. It does not, or it does not force them to unionize. It doesn't have any kind of legal meaning aside from the athletes knowing in the back of their heads that, hey, if we want to do this, we can do this. But unionization has to start from the athletes. It has to start from the ground up. It has to start from labor. To have any kind of system where the employers are able to say, you're a union now, would be completely antithetical to all of the goals and aspirations of labor law and of union law and everything like that. I mean, we see situations like that. We see situations where we have kind of like company unions that are, kind of dictated and controlled by the companies. And the NLRB, boy, do they not like those, and for good reason, because it's exploitive in its own merit. And I don't think I'm not necessarily saying that's what would happen here, but there's certainly a fear that it would happen where, and I think I talked about this in the lost collective bargaining episode, where I think there's a legitimate fear from a lot of people of the NCAA could say, okay, well, hey, SAC's a union now. We're going to recognize them as a union. And a lot of people in athlete labor organizing would stop and be like, whoa, that is not at all a good thing. And frankly, they'd be right.
Does the answer to Joe's question at all depend on whether or not there's a determination that the conference is the employer, or how does that piece fit into it when we don't even know they haven't been deemed employees? They're not called employees by anybody. How does that piece of it fit in? Who is the employer? Where does that come?
Yeah, because that also yields a lot of other questions where, the conference could say, hey, we're going to be considered your employer. We're going to be voluntarily recognized. And the NLRB still, I mean, again, it's kind of a weird case of first impression here. But the NLRB presumably might have the power to step in and say, well, you're actually not the employer. The schools are the employer, and they're public employers, so we can't do anything about it. A NLRB that's largely against unionization, which is kind of the landscape we have right now, may be willing to step in and do that. I don't know if they necessarily have the authority to do it, and I also can't say for sure that they'd even want to do that because, I think a big thing throughout labor law is if both the employees and the employers want to do something and they're able to agree to it, the courts and the NLRB are going to step aside as long as it's in good faith and at arm's length. But that's not necessarily for sure, because we have the NLRB that might step in. We have the states themselves that may step in and assert themselves as we are enforcing our law that says that public employees cannot unionize. And even if you say that you are employees, or that even if you, the conferences, say that you're the employer, we do not feel that way. We feel the schools are the employer, and it is our interest as a state, given that this is a state institution, to assert our labor laws here. And I imagine courts would probably back them. So again, like I said at the beginning, you got to get the states in on this as well.
I have so many more questions, but I don't think I should ask any of them because we'd be here for another 45 minutes. Okay. Yeah, I have a lot.
One.
Might need to be a two-parter.
And make it your unilateral decision.
No, because I want to ask, if let's say 100% of ACC schools had student athletes that said they wanted to unionize, with the conference. I mean, could the NLRB overrule state laws?
No, they couldn't. The NLRB would probably do the exact same thing they did in Northwestern and say, even though we have 100% of athletes in this conference that want to unionize, we cannot assert jurisdiction over the. I mean, just thinking about the ACC right now, it's probably 75% of them that are public employees. I mean, Florida State, Clemson's public, right? Yeah, they're public. Clemson, North Carolina, Boston College. A lot of these, like, Cal and Boston College are in states, obviously, where public employee unionization is more encouraged. But Florida State and Clemson and all these other ones are not. So, yeah, no, the NLRB would they would not step in. The interesting question becomes when, if this ever to be the case, if Jim Phillips were to say, hey, all of you have decided to unionize, we welcome it. We voluntarily recognize it. That gets fascinating, and I do not have an answer to that question.
That was my follow-up
ever
question.
Seen it before.
That was my follow-up question. So if they all do it and the conference recognizes it, but those states don't allow for this, like, does this just then move on to be a collective bargaining agreement between the states, the schools and states that allow it versus, this is why, like, my brain is hurting and it's going down a lot of rabbit holes and I don't even know if I'm making sense anymore.
I mean, I will say, there has to be a lawsuit. Like, if the NLRB decides we're going to leave this alone, if the Attorney General of South Carolina, where I looked into this before, I'm pretty sure South Carolina is one of the states that doesn't allow public employee collective bargaining at all. If the South Carolina Attorney General says we're going to leave this alone because it's the will of Clemson to do this, I mean, it's not like I don't think just a random fan who doesn't like the idea of unionization and collective bargaining in college sports can come in and say I have standing to file a lawsuit here. It has to be someone who actually has a case or controversy. But is that likely? Probably not.
What is likely?
Yeah.
Don't have an answer to that question either.
Okay.
Maybe that's the unilateral decision. What is the most likely? No. Okay. Unilateral decision time. We can do
Tuberville's bill passing. That's the most likely. We're back to last week.
Sam said is not
likely. I don't think that's the word you're looking for. I think you're looking for impossible.
It sounds like everything's impossible. It really does. Like, we're gonna have this show for the next 10 years.
I hope so. I'm having fun.
Good.
Yeah.
I'm having fun too. All right, unilateral decision. Unilateral decision. If you're a Stanford administrator, what is your response to this?
Which administrator?
Pick.
Which unit? Which unit of the university?
Doesn't matter. You're an admin. Pick whatever position you want to be representing, and give me your response to this. To Sam's point, I mean, that doesn't mean nobody else has heard anything from Stanford, but none of us have. So, kind of fits that.
So there's a lot of politics at play, many of which I don't know. So I guess that makes it easier for me to just answer. But I would. If I guess in part I'll give you two answers because one I fear is too much of a cop out. But my gut reaction is to go to university leadership from that viewpoint, and I would want to respond with sort of the will of my existing workforce and those who have already been identified as employees within the university system and structure, and have an understanding from the faculty board and professional staff, administrative groups within the university of what is the position on this, and is this a group that we want to welcome in as part of this, or do we see them as different, and how do you want that to look? And I know that at some point the university president or what have you has to take a position of leadership and make a decision, but I would be very interested in that group's opinion on what this looks like, because there's a lot of pride in that, and I know that from working very loosely, but working with the Dartmouth organization when the men's basketball group did organize, they had a lot of that support. They had a lot of support from faculty senate and other groups on campus to say, yeah, like essentially you're one of us. Like you're one of us. We support you. This is how you do it. This is what it looks like. These are the benefits. These are the reasons why. And if Stanford has similar collegiality on campus with that feeling, then if I'm in administration, I'm going to back those folks. I'm going to be with them, and I'm going to take that opportunity to try to move the ball forward on this thing that could be very, you're at the front of this. You're at the forefront of trying to get this done, and you're doing it with the support of the people that, frankly, you need and are really, really important to you. And so that's my first take. And my other take is honestly similar from like an athletics administration standpoint of you're at Stanford. Like you may want to protect your job above all, but you're at Stanford, and Stanford has kind of a position within higher ed and athletics of being a first mover on some of these things and being, people oriented and being in this position of, kind of getting to do the right thing. And I go back to that a little bit. And I know that that's very subjective, especially in this topic of employment, but if it's what they want, if it's what the people that you are in charge of protecting have told you they want, then support them and try to go do that in the most advocate forward way that you can of trying to be for the people that you are in charge of protecting. That's ultimately what your job is as the athletic director. You're there to serve and protect the athletes that you are giving these opportunities to and the employees that are in your department. And so that would be a part of the conversation as well. But if they're raising their hands and saying we want to be a part of this, I would go full force trying to support them in doing that.
Mike was afraid of giving a cop-out answer. I'm going to drive right into that ditch. I think the answer is exactly what Stanford's doing, which is nothing. Because I think you're kind of stuck in a rock and a hard place on this situation, where if you come out and say you support the union and that you think that the future of college sports is a collective bargaining agreement, you're going to risk pissing off the NCAA. You're going to risk pissing off the ACC potentially as well. You're going to risk getting in the way potentially of the Protect College Sports Act. I actually saw Matt Gaetz, of all people, the former congressman from Florida. I saw a tweet from him saying that this means that we're not going to see federal legislation passed because all the Democrats are going to jump on and say, see, unionization can happen. We want unionization to happen. You're going to piss off people like that because, you might have the Democrats come in and say, yes, clearly this is a sign that unionization can happen. Stanford, even their administration is saying that they're willing to support this. So why are we passing an antitrust exemption again? Like, let's just do it with collective bargaining. Let's just do that federal law instead, where we allow for that. So you're stepping in a whole world of hurt on that front. But on the other hand, to Mike's point, you're absolutely right that Stanford is an institution with a very, it's in the Bay Area of California. It's a very liberal area. It's a very, pro-union area. It's a very pro-employee area. If you come out and do what Dartmouth did and say, we're not going to recognize you, you're not employees, we firmly object to this, then you risk pissing off all of them as well, and you risk creating a firestorm on your campus, and you risk the California government coming in and investigating you for union busting and all these different things. But there's a big difference between this and Dartmouth, which is that you haven't seen a petition yet. You're not going to see a petition for at least a couple of years because they're going to be waiting until there's a change in presidential administration. So you don't really have to do anything right now. And like my heart, I want to agree with everything Mike says. I do agree with everything Mike says. I think that you take a leadership stance on this, but from a practical risk management perspective, from just a reality of the situation perspective, I think saying and doing nothing is the right call right now. And, every bone in my body, it feels betrayed at that statement, but that's the truth.
You're talking to two PR guys, so it's okay.
Fair enough.
You just took the PR trained position, and that we respect that.
You guys are rubbing off on me. That's a problem.
Good. Good. Maybe your knowledge will rub off on me because I'm still confused.
That'll help.
Me too. So
Initially when I thought about this question, I thought about it from, the media relations standpoint and coming at it from that perspective. But Mike and listening to him talk, I think I changed my mind. And if I went the PR route, that'd have been a cop out too. So I think, like Mike, I'm going to put myself in the AD position. And I hear everything you said, Sam, about making the NCAA mad, potentially making the conference mad. But to Mike's point, yes, you got to play nice in the sandbox with all of those folks, but you answer to your student athletes. And so I think football is where it's at right now. And Sam, I think you're dead on. I don't think you need to do anything there. But I do think you have several other sport programs that you need to make sure you're getting in front of and having conversations with. At least, to make sure, because if this all starts happening, Stanford has 78 sport programs on campus. I mean, obviously I'm exaggerating, but they got a lot.
That'd be an exaggeration. Slight exaggeration. I think it's like, I don't know if 78, I think it might be like 77.
But if this conversation is now happening amongst every one of your sport programs, and this is becoming the focal point, and you're losing sight of why you're there, which is to compete and to get an education, I think you're missing the mark from a leadership perspective. So like Mike, I'm probably, you don't probably meshing both of what you guys are saying. I don't think you necessarily have to do anything, but you need to ensure that if these conversations are happening, that you can help them, make this productive. And so it's not just a bunch of teams running around trying to figure out what to do and losing sight of what their goal is, which is to get a Stanford education and to compete for national championships. And a lot of those guys will end up being Olympians as well. So if I'm the AD at Stanford, that's my next step. I'm trying to get in front of every one of these sport programs and ensuring that if you're having these conversations and you need to be pointed in the right direction, we are here to help you so that this does not become a distraction. That's probably where I'm going. I don't know if Sam agrees or disagrees or likes it. I couldn't tell.
You need his approval?
Yeah, sometimes. Sometimes. Well, anything else on this topic, guys?
I think we've covered it. I mean, we could spend another hour covering it, but I think an hour is enough.
This will be another episode this year. Before 2026 is over, we'll have another collective bargaining episode. I'm sure of it.
Probably.
So I feel good for now.
100% agree with you. Well, that'll do it for this week's edition of Unilateral Decisions. See you next week.